Okay, everybody out there. Welcome, Constant Gamer, to tonight's episode of Role Player with a Thousand Faces. My name is Matt Yancik. I am your humble host for tonight's festivities. And I'm here tonight with someone who needs, in my opinion, needs no introduction. So I have been a huge fan of Monte Cook Games for like since I first saw a copy of Numenera sitting on the shelf of my local comic book and gaming store when I was living up in Alaska. And I picked that thing up and I was like, holy cannoli. I was just like completely transported to another world. The system itself, I absolutely fell in love with. And tonight I have the co-founder and co-owner at Monte Cook Games. I have one half of the Monte Cook Games kind of like foundry or foundation here. I have none other than Shanna Germain. So Shanna has been in the biz for quite a while. She's an author, she's an editor, and a game designer. She's got dozens of works to her name across multiple genres and formats, poetry, articles and essays. Correct me if I'm wrong on any of this. Short stories, novellas and novels, tabletop and role-playing games. So she's been around in the business, like I said, for about 20 years, and she oh is most recently responsible for working on MCG's latest Kickstarter project, which of course was The Devil Made Us Do It, which funded at like 350 grand. Oh my gosh! But that's just another day at MCG for Shauna. So Shauna, I'm talking too much. Welcome.
You're perfect. I feel like that list of things it just explains how old I am.
Oh, well, okay, well, let's put it this way. I've got 20 years in a business, but I don't have that many things to my name. So if we're equally old, you're more accomplished on the
Yikes.
scale. So I do appreciate you coming on. How's it going tonight? How are you doing over there?
Good. I spent all day working on a novel, which is a joy that I deeply, deeply love. So that's great. And yeah, it's starting to rain a little bit here in the Pacific Northwest. It feels like fall. The world is crumbling, but you take your pleasures where you can,
But
and
isn't
that's
it
a good thing.
I gotta say, since I first saw the Goonies in the theater many, many years ago, which took place in the Pacific Northwest, and I was wondering, and I asked my mom afterward, why was it always raining in every scene? And she's like, Matthew, that's the Pacific Northwest. Isn't the rain not surprising? Isn't it just always raining there?
This year has been very dry with and even drier with the fires. So it's been a very weird year here. Like we are desperate for rain, and so every little bit of rain, in the Pacific Northwest, when it just sort of rains a little bit, we don't really think of that as raining. We're just like, it's not really. But right now, because
Right.
it's been so dry, like a little bit of rain, and we're like, yes,
So
it's
like a steady drizzle
raining.
is just normal, but then when there's a downpour, you're like, oh, it's raining. So your scale has
Yeah,
been kind of recalibrated in that
very
particular
true.
case. Cool.
Very
I kind of miss that. So for people that have been kind of watching me before, and there are tens of thousands, or maybe it's just a couple hundred, they would know that, of course, I used to live in Alaska, and Alaska doesn't really get that kind of Pacific Northwest weather, but it's kind of a little bit Pacific Northwesterly to me, and I kind of miss that. I actually like that. Well, at any rate, thanks so much. We're not here to talk about the weather. We're here to talk about cooler things. So tell us, let's start out with a simple question, an easy question. What were you like as a child, Shauna? Were you always so creative? Were you like hoping to become the role-playing titan that you are today, or was this kind of like just an accident?
Well, it's funny when I think about like what I was like a ghost child. Like all the pictures of me as a kid, I had this shockingly white hair and this very pale skin and this very sullen, sort of scared expression. And so like all pictures of me are just right. And so I suspect that I was a very quiet, shy child, which has not changed that much. I'm still very quiet and shy. But I did want to be Stephen King when I grew up because
Oh my
I
gosh, good for you. Good
I
for
loved his work
you.
so much when I was a kid.
Yes.
And to the point where my parents sort of banned me from reading it, which is, not a thing that my parents normally would do. They're very open.
Let's put a
But I
pin
was
in
so
this.
obsessed with it. Oh,
Let's
sorry.
wait. I'm so sorry. No, don't be sorry. Let's see here. I want to know more about the Stephen King obsession. You're talking to somebody that just drove up to Bangor to and got
Fun.
the requisite photo in front of his house. When did you start reading King?
So my parents are super hippie and super liberal, and so we had this amazing collection of fiction and sci-fi and fantasy and things that I should not have been reading at the age that I was reading them. Like I actually remember reading Watership Down, and I was so young that I didn't
Mm,
know the phrase. There's a phrase like, and he bit his head off, and I thought it was literal. I wasn't old enough to know what that phrase meant. And so,
right.
when I got to closer to that like end of the book and realized the rabbit whose head bitten off was still alive, I was completely freaked out because I had cried. So when I started reading Stephen King, I was way too young to be reading him.
I don't know if you can be too young. Like I think in a way to me, I see what I like about Stephen King's work is that I think we're lucky, I think, in that if a child's going to pick up his work, he does basically have a good like from what I understand of his, his tweets and what I've know of him and all of that, he seems to have a very good heart. So I think that at the core for like a young kid to read something like Stephen King, I think he's a great I mean I recommend him. I teach 10, 11, 12-year olds and I recommend him with parents' permission all the
I think it
time.
was when I started writing poems about cannibalistic flowers that my parents sort of said enough.
D- Oh, did you know what that reminds me of? Did you read in his Skeleton Crew collection he had a poem called Paranoid a Chant. Do you remember that
That
at
sounds
all?
vaguely familiar. It's been a really long time, but I know that I read Skeleton Crew. So
Yeah.
yeah.
That was kind of like my introduction. So you were kind of mixing it up with this stuff. Were you playing any games back then, or?
My first role playing game was, not surprisingly, because I brought up Watership Down, was Bunnies and Burrows. My
Oh,
babysitter brought it over, and I was really young. And I think I didn't really understand what it meant to play a role playing game. I just knew that I got to
mm,
be a bunny and I got to run around thumping my feet on the floor. And that was sort of like the best thing ever for young
yeah,
me. And so I don't think I understood that at that age. I probably didn't really understand that it was even a game because it didn't have like things that I thought of as a game. And I also didn't really understand like role playing or anything because as a kid, that's just what you do, right? You
right.
just pretend to be other things. And so it wasn't actually probably until much later that I even realized that was sort of my first introduction to such a thing.
What it's kind of interesting that you say that because I often think of, in a way, I think of role playing as adult, and I'd never made this connection before, but I was talking to a friend of a friend who had never heard of had never heard of a role playing game, and she looked at me and she just said, "Oh, it's adult play," after I
Mm-hmm.
described it, and I thought about it for a second, and the woman that I was talking to was a doctor, and she's a brain doctor or whatever. And I thought, okay, well, if she thinks this is adult play, in a way, like I completely think that's true because I often look around the table and I see a bunch of people that are sitting around pretending to be like goblins or trolls or some other type of creature. So it's interesting that you'd make that to me connection. Um, so in that particular case, then you're playing games that you don't know are role playing games at the time. But was there a moment where you sort of said, "Ah, I'm going to sort of seek these things out," and you decided I'm going to look for them, or were you going to board games, or did you set it aside for your writing?
My whole family were big game players. My grandmother, in particular, like introduced us really early on to like games, like card games, and she loved to play games, and she loved to totally beat us, and
Hmm.
to
That's what good
sort of
grandmothers do.
right to sort of teach us how to be a good loser, which was
Mm-hmm.
something that I took a very long time to learn.
Mm-hmm.
And but I didn't sort of pick up role playing games again until high school. I played on the guys' soccer team because we didn't have a girls' soccer team because I'm old and this is a long time ago. And the all the guys on my soccer team played Dungeons and Dragons in the summer. They like went out in the woods and they ran around and with sticks and so that was sort of when I got back into role playing games was in high school, and then I kind of left it for a long time. I got really into MMOs. I played a lot of
Hmm.
EverQuest 2 and World of Warcraft and that kind of stuff. Partly because I wasn't in a physical place where a lot of people I knew were playing role playing games. And so I sort of transported my love of games into online games for a while, because plus they were kind of new and exciting, and like it was something that lots of people were doing. And then I came back to role-playing games probably in my early 30s, I guess. So I have kind of gone up and down as to whether or not it's been in my life, mostly access, because there wasn't Zoom, and so if people around you weren't playing, it was really hard to find a group to play with.
Right. No, I kind of had a period in my life like that as well. It's like interesting. I look back there because I don't know about you, but like when I was in my early like 20s or whatever, I realized I was an adult and I needed to be an adult. I needed to set aside, my childhood stuff, and I sort of set it aside, and I was an adult for 5, 6, 7 years before I realized I was full of crap and that like I was pretending to be something I wasn't, and there wasn't any reason. So there was a period of my own life as well where I just set them aside, and I didn't have people to play with. But during that time, were you still writing, or were you kind of doing something else? Like, did you?
Yeah, I've always written. It's something that's been steady, and it's like the probably the only thing that's been steady my whole life is
Hmm.
that I have loved to write. I've written for most of that time. I made my living. I worked at newspapers. I wrote for glossy magazines and trade
Oh, wow.
magazines.
Okay.
It was for a long time. I sort of wrote whatever I could. I wrote marketing things. I sort of did whatever, and a lot of that was such good training for me because I figured out how to meet deadlines and how to, write in all different kinds of styles. And at the same time, I was doing poetry and I was doing, literary fiction and stuff on the side, essays, that kind of stuff. So writing has always, always been my first love. And I would say that even more so, fiction has been my first love. But I spent a lot of time being afraid of trying that, being afraid to try and make a living in fiction, because it was the only thing I knew I wanted to do my whole life. And I was deeply, deeply afraid that if I failed, I didn't know why I was here. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't have a backup plan or a purpose. And so I think I spent a lot of years running from, sort of putting that at the forefront, even though I always did it in the background.
So what were you doing then? Let me ask this. Does that mean that you were doing other things? Did you have like a steady 9 to 5 job and you would like go home and write, or were you always trying to patch those little jobs together, writing here and there and make a living out of it?
It's such a path, right? Like, so I started, like I said, I made a living working for newspapers and glossy magazines, and then I edited a women's feminist magazine, co-founded and edited for a long time, and then I
Hmm.
helped found and edit a scientific coffee roasting magazine. So I worked in the
Oh,
coffee
cool.
industry, doing that for a long time. And all the time, like I said, writing fiction on the side. And then for a couple of years, for quite a while actually, I made a living writing erotica, because erotica pays a ton of money. And I couldn't get my literary fiction accepted because the books and stuff kept saying, "Oh, you've got too much sex in here. You've got too much sex in here."
Hmm.
And someone said, "Why don't you try submitting to actual sex sites?" And I was like, "Oh, that's a thing."
Right.
And then it turned out that not only did they like my work, but they paid me way, way more money than literary magazines and stuff paid. So I did that for quite a while, and then sort of got like, I kind of was I was in a bunch of the best of public anthologies, and I kind
Oh,
of
that's
just couldn't
awesome.
find a way to write about sex in a different and interesting way anymore. It's
Let
sort of
me ask
sort of
though,
got overwhelming.
and this is going to be personal, but not in the way you think it is. Does that pay the bills? Like
Mm-hmm.
writing will pay,
Oh
because
my
so
gosh.
many so many times I talk to a writer and I ask them, and sometimes it'll be off camera, sometimes it's on camera. And there are so many writers out there that I think of as being famous or successful or whatever, and they will look at me and go, "Well, I don't actually make that much money for this copy." And they have the same sort of problems that maybe a regular Joe might have. But you were selling erotica and selling these short stories and all of that was enough for you to support yourself and make it through however many years.
Yeah, between editing and writing, I have worked. This is the only job I've had for God. Okay, so I'm almost 50, and I've been doing this since I was 22. So
Oh, wow.
a long time.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, and it's not easy, and you have to hodgepodge it, especially in the beginning. You're sort of taking everything that comes your way and you're kind of hodgepodging it, and you're working really, really, really hard to sort of take everything, right? There comes a point where you're suddenly like, I said yes to too many things, and the first time you have to say no as a freelancer, it's like a panic moment because
Right.
you're like, oh my god, no one's ever going to ask me to write for them again. Like,
Right.
I'm
Right.
going to ruin my career. So
Yeah.
like, I mean, I sort of always had kind of a day job of something, whether that was writing for the newspaper or editing a magazine, and then supplementing, or doing erotica and then supplementing it with, the essays and that kind of stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
it isn't like a steady paycheck, and you don't have insurance. Not that a
Yeah.
lot of jobs in this country have insurance, but and
Right.
you're paying your taxes quarterly, and like it's a whole business thing that you have to kind of learn. And like I learned it the hard way. I was like, I have to pay, all this money in taxes at the end of the year. I'll have this. Like I didn't even know how to pay quarterly taxes when I started. Like there's just so much I didn't know.
Right.
It's been such a learning process.
What do you think? Now, here's the interesting thing to me, though. I mean, if you're starting out in your 20s and you want to write, and you are obviously a smart person, and in order to get stuff on the page and to have people to submit it and then have people purchase it and all of that stuff, they've you know, it's got to be well written and well done, and you've got to have skill and talent in some way, shape, or form. But there are so many writers, so many people, so many young people in their 20s out there that are in their, they give up, or they're not able to put it together, and maybe they do have talent and they just give up. What was it about Shanna Germain that enabled her to sort of keep plugging along and not get upset by a rejection letter, or not get upset that it wasn't like automatically you just get a writing gig and then you're famous or whatever?
Did I get the implication that I didn't get upset?
Oh, okay. Let
No,
me
I
let
mean,
me
it's
scrub that part out.
heartbreaking. Oh, it's
Hmm.
heartbreaking to be rejected. Oh my God, right? Like it's devastating. It is. I mean, we're all afraid of being rejected, whether that's in our love life or our familiar relationships or our work. Like, I mean, it isn't, it's never easy. Like, I mean, not for me. I don't want to speak for anyone else. It's not easy for me. Still not easy. I get rejected still. And it's heartbreaking, right? You're just like, oh, I worked so hard on that or whatever. But to the question, I think there's a couple of things. One is, I had amazing support. Like I had a writers group that was so good to me, that totally took me under their wing and helped me and taught me and like, just uplifted me. And I think that there's so many people in my life that I owe my success to, because they just were there for me when I needed. And it's something I always hope that I pay back, because you just don't know who you can touch and help and just uplift in an interesting and useful way. So that's part of it. And part of it is that I am very lucky in that I had parents who were like, you can do anything you want to
Hmm.
do. But then I started writing erotica. My dad was like, I wish I hadn't taught you that. In a
But they're
very supportive,
hippie
funny way,
parents,
not
weren't
not for
they?
real.
They're
Sorry.
You were saying they're hippie parents, right? They weren't like, "Hey, this is cool," or if she
Yeah,
can.
no, they were super supportive. It's sort of a running joke that my parents were like, oh no. But I think I've just always had this sort of strength of will that comes from being defiant. Like
Yeah,
I have a lot of fu in me.
yeah. Well, to that point, then let me ask you this: like you were saying that you were submitting stuff to magazines and they were telling you, or you were submitting to different publishers and they were telling you there's too much sex in it, which is like a really shorthand way, and maybe a way of not acknowledging. It's almost in a way like saying, look, this isn't art. This isn't what we're looking for. This isn't like what. Do you feel that it's like an unappreciated kind of form? We have like a few classic erotic writers, for example, that I can count them on maybe my hand. Anais Nin, of course, is the one that comes to mind, and like a few others. But maybe Henry Miller. But I don't. I also often get kind of confused as to whether or not that was. But what do you think about it? Do you think it's an underappreciated form and it's not acknowledged as, you know, for the importance that maybe it really holds for people?
Well, I think that's a really great question and a very complicated answer. And part of the answer is that at the time I didn't understand the markets I was submitting to. So the fact that there was too much sex in my writing was
Oh,
was a constraint of the market. Like I was submitting to like literary markets, and literary markets have changed. I think, I mean, this, like I said, this was 25 years ago or whatever.
mm,
So they have changed greatly. The amount of sex that we have in our regular fiction has opened up a ton, which I think is
mm,
awesome. Um, I think that erotica has gone through up and downs, and and just like every other sort of genre that's out there, and it's interesting because like I feel like when I was really doing a lot of erotica, it was a very hot topic. Like, I mean, I had people show up on my doorstep a couple times telling me that I was going to go to hell because I, wrote lesbian sex, and you
I
just
have
don't
that
see that
normally,
anymore.
and
People
I'm
don't
not in it.
care.
People do that to me all the time, and I'm not. I don't write that sort of stuff at all.
And I sort of miss the days when sort of the worst thing that was happening in the world was writing about lesbian
Right.
sex. That was a pretty looking back, that was a pretty fine time. So I think that like every genre, right now we're in a time where like superheroes and
Right.
sci-fi and fantasy is just having this amazing heyday. And sort of I think it all goes up and down, and it depends a lot on like what topics are being talked about and
Yeah.
what's on people's mind. And I don't know, it's all very complicated, and it makes it hard because like one of the difficulties I think of putting erotica into just this specific genre where it's supposed to live is that we pull it out of everyday life, right? And sex is part of everyday life, and so suddenly it becomes this sort of thing that's over here, and that's problematic. I mean, it's problematic when we do it with anything that's part of our lives. We sort of stick it in the basement and
Yeah.
act it's supposed to be something we're embarrassed about, and that's always really unfortunate.
Yeah. It's interesting though because I hear, and you can just read interviews with writers, with horror writers, with science fiction writers, with mystery writers, and time and again you hear how frustrated they are because they'll just say many of them will, some will just say yes, I'm a horror writer. Others will say no, I'm a writer. And like you see that say with Stephen King perhaps as maybe a classic example where he of course has a big enough name where you can kind of like mix it up and put his books on different in different categories like at Barnes and Noble or wherever you happen to be shopping, and people are going to find him. But if you're a smaller writer like that likes to write across genres, then the publishers kind of sometimes look at you and they're like, well, what kind of a writer are you? We can't put you in one niche and or one box. So I can kind of see what you're saying. And there's sometimes there comes along to me anyway. There's like a writer that comes along and breaks a taboo, like Stephen King with the horror broke so many taboos, and now it's mainstream, if you want to maybe call it that. Um, anyway, sorry about that. I went off on my own ideas there for a second. Let's get back to Shanna Germain. So tell me then, are you attempting to write a novel here along the way, or and I'm interested in which came first, getting back into games and role playing, or a novel attempt, or what, or were they about the same
Um,
time?
I would say that I was very focused on short fiction. So I started as a poet,
Hmm.
and that my first published pieces were poems, and I didn't publish poets, published
Hmm.
poems,
Sure, you could
and
do that if you want.
sure, why not? And so then I moved into short stories because I was so used to telling a story in such a small amount of space that
Hmm.
short stories was a real leap for me. And then, of course, novels being giant
Yeah.
were an even bigger leap. And I was just like, what do I fill all these pages with? So I actually wasn't a novelist for most of my writing career. And then actually, so I started. I heard this radio interview with these two women who were talking about this thing that they had heard. This was probably like 10 or 12 years ago, maybe. No, maybe more than that, maybe 15 years ago. They'd heard this, they looked at this study, and the study had said that one of the most quickly growing population of gamers was successful, driven women in their 30s, in their late 30s. And these women were making fun of that. They were like, how can you play video games and be a successful business owner? That doesn't make, like, they
Hmm.
were just sort of destroying it. And I was so mad. I
Yeah.
did say I had a little FU in me. I was so mad that I was like, because I was a successful businesswoman in my late 30s who was playing a lot of video games.
Right. Exactly.
And I was like, I'm going to become more open and out there about this. And so I started writing for like the World of Warcraft official magazine and like a bunch of online publications that were around then about online games and or about video games of various sorts. And so that was sort of my step into writing about games, even though it was on the video game side. And so I did that for a while, and then an opportunity came up to work on Numenera, and I sort of was like, yes, please. And right around the same time, my first novel was I had signed my first contract for a novel. And so suddenly I was doing two whole brand new things at the same time, which
Oh,
I
wow.
don't know. Do I recommend that? I'm not sure. It was
Yeah,
pretty,
when
it
it
was
rains,
pretty
it pours.
traumatic. We were running this Kickstarter, and I'm sorry, say again. I'm just
When it
talking.
rains, it pours.
Yes, yes. So I was finishing my first novel, under contract, under deadline, didn't know what I was doing, had no idea. It was an erotic novel. And then also we were running this Kickstarter, brand new thing for us, didn't know what we were doing. It was quite a kind of a wild time. And
What happened there then? So I'm kind of curious about this. So you've got a possible first novel that's about to be published or getting picked up or whatever the writing publishing term is. And then you said, oh yeah, you just sort of threw something out there. Like, oh yeah, and this thing, Numenera came along. How does it just come along? Did you? I'm just
well,
befuddled right now.
sorry,
What?
there's my history is like complicated, isn't it? I'm not doing a very good job of explaining
No,
it. So,
it's fine.
so at the time I was talking to Monty, and he said, "Hey, I'm thinking about doing this little game. I'm really excited about it. It's just this little tiny project. I don't even know if anybody's going to care about it, but I'm deeply in love with the
This
world."
two
And
volume this two volume game with like
yeah,
dozens of
yeah. And he's like, and
hardcover
I'm gonna try to
supplements.
run a Kickstarter. And I was like, cool, that sounds cool. I've been interested in Kickstarter for a long time. I kind of want to know how it works. I would love to edit it. Like and so we were just sort of chatting, and like we really thought that it was just going to be this little tiny thing. And then it kind of blew up on us.
Yeah.
And that was lovely, but also very unexpected. And so suddenly everything changed. Like it was just a whole
How
amazing
may
experience.
how did you I'm not just talking to Monty over here. How were you just talking to Monty? Did you know him like from somewhere else or like
Well, I think we were already dating at that point. So we were
oh,
pretty
okay.
in each other's lives about what was happening and what was going on.
Right, right, right,
So
right.
I guess, yes, I knew him before, and I knew everything that he was working on. And yeah, he was just like, hey, I'm going to do this project. And I was like, hey, I want to do that project with you. And of course, he still was like, you know, I mean, I had a ton of experience editing, and I had a ton of experience working in the game industry. And so and even so, he was like, games are not like, editing games is not like all the other stuff that you've done. And so he was a great mentor. I learned so much through
Right.
that process.
What
Um,
at that time were you like playing games at that point or was it video game stuff or was it tabletop stuff
There was a little bit of
or both?
everything. I think I was playing, I want to say I was playing a lot of maybe Fallout at that point, at that time. Like that was
Hmm.
my big video game. And then I feel like I was in a Call of Cthulhu thing right before Numenera. And then of course, suddenly playtesting a ton of Numenera all of a sudden as well. And then yeah, I feel like for a while there, it was mostly Numenera. And then whenever we went to a convention, I would play some new game that was on the table just to check it out and kind of see what other people were doing and have that experience of like just sort of being a player again. Because being a player in a game is so different than playtesting. It's just an absolute, I mean, it's completely different.
That's what I was going to ask you about. What was it that you enjoyed? So if you were role playing when you were in, in like your teen years or whatever, but then there's this space where you're not role playing and then you come back to it later. What was it like coming back to role playing as an adult? And what attracted you enough to like first of all maybe, start playing again, but then second of all continue to play?
It's a really interesting question because I've asked myself that a lot. Like, why? Like, what is the appeal about different types of games for me? Because I am deeply introverted. I'm very shy. I'm super quiet. I think when I write, so I'm not even that good of a player in this way of like some people are quippy or their
Mm.
characters are like so fully immersed and they're really on the ball with, and I need time to think and process and like
Yeah.
figure out my character. And so that makes me kind of a quiet player, is the truth. And so I need a group that understands that I'm having a great time, even if I'm a little bit quiet and I'm taking everything in, and I'm not sort of constantly like, uh, my characters aren't very dialogue-y in that way. And so having a great group is so important. Like people who are willing to kind of roll with your unique characteristics. And like that's a complicated space, right? Because you've got an extrovert in the group and they have to be willing to give you space as an introvert.
Mm.
Right. And that's hard for them and it's hard for me because I'm not going to interrupt someone. And so
Yeah.
I think having a great group is really, really a big part of that. And also, I'm very story driven, and so narrative games, I feel like the narrative game market, there's just so many more than there were when I
Yeah,
was sort of first started
for
playing.
sure.
So I think that, and settings that I just deeply, deeply love, like just like all kinds of cool creative settings that weren't sort of, I mean, there's nothing wrong with this sort of Tolkien-esque repetition, but like, things that were different and weird. And I really like new things. I like, things I've never seen before,
Mm.
experienced before. And so the fact that there were more games like that coming out was really appealing to me.
So it kind of fired your imagination and like seeing all this stuff. Like I don't know about you, but when I see games, they kind of whet my appetite for stuff. There are too many. Like now, I feel a little bit like we're living in a golden age of role playing. Like it's just
For
blown
sure.
up so much, and
Yeah.
it's so hard for me like to dedicate myself to one game for like a few play sessions. Like there are a few games that really attract me because, well, at least hold my attention because then there's something else that comes out, and it's no slight against whatever game I'm playing. It's
Right.
just that new game you're like, holy cannoli, like what? I've
Yeah.
never seen this before, and you're
Yeah.
like blown
That's
away.
awesome.
Do you consider yourself like let's take the business side out of it and the play testing side out of it. Do you consider yourself more of a player or a game master when you're playing privately?
I would say that game master is my natural status.
Hmm.
I can command a room, I can stand up and give a speech in front of 10,000 people,
Yeah.
but I can't walk into a party by myself. Like those are my strengths are presenting and being at sort of being kind of on the stage in that way. And I feel like jamming allows me to do that and allows me to improv a lot, which is something that actually I'm good at when I'm in that space.
Yeah.
Being a player, I love being a player. It's much harder for me. I feel like every time I'm a player, it's a growth experience where I'm trying to be a better co-player. I'm trying to be a better person who's immersed into character. I'm trying to, I just feel like there's all these things I'm constantly learning, which is wonderful and great and such an opportunity. But it isn't my natural state at all, I don't think. I think, yeah, I tend to get really quiet.
Why, let me ask you about this. You just said that you can go to a party and you don't feel like you can be the extrovert, but then when you're at the table, suddenly you can command the room. What do you think is the what does that say about what do you think that says about you? Why would that be? Because to me, they seem like, well, I guess they're different, but I'd like to hear why you think maybe they're, or if you
Um,
think they're
I
different.
I think that just like games are a way to give us parameters about social interactions, right? Here are the rules, here are how you do this. I feel like a
Mm.
GMing or being on the stage, giving a presentation has a certain set of social parameters that are
Mm.
easier for me to work within. I understand that I'm there to educate or entertain or whatever the role is with for the audience, and to give space to my other panelists or
Yeah.
whatever I'm doing there. And so I think that I do best when I have some guidance on how to work, how to move within a social situation. And there's not a lot of guidance in regular social situations. You walk into a party and you don't know anyone, and you're like, "Hello, where's the cat? I would like to talk
Right.
to the cat," because that's where I'm most comfortable. And so I think they're just very different skill sets and maybe comfort zones.
Yeah.
I work really hard on the sort of player experience and growing into that space, but it is hard for me. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I kind of see what you're saying there because you get like if you have a rule book there, you sort of know you have your footing at least in theory within the realm of the rules. But then if you go into the party, it's like there's 18 1,000 different things that could be going on and social dynamics that you're not aware of, and not everyone is there to follow the rules as maybe you see them or as they aren't published, I
Yeah, there's
guess.
another interesting part of that that you just made me think of, which is about social footprint. And so, like, if I'm the GM of a game, I expect that everyone who's here is here by choice. They knew I was the GM. They came to play a game with me as the GM, and so I'm less worried about having a big social footprint on them because they have sort of come here by choice. But like if you're at a party and you're like, oh, I don't want to take up that person's time, or I don't know if that person wants to talk to me, not wanting to create a big social footprint on someone else when
Right.
there aren't those sort of parameters, I think can really be even more difficult for someone who might be shy or introverted, and that makes a
Yes.
difference too for
And
me.
exactly, and you don't really know where your limits and kind of the lines are. And it's kind of interesting because someone that I know, Brian Kurtz, is in the chat. He's an internet friend of mine who I've met through the internet, the miracle of the internet, and he is just mentioning like it made him think about the conventions around the kind of extroversion that's needed in teaching. And I guess that's sort of true. Like I don't know if you've done teaching, but I mean I've done about 20 years of it, and I feel sort of like there are certain parameters when I walk into a classroom, and I know what I can and cannot do, and there's subtleties there in each classroom based on the dynamic and the students and stuff. But in general, I know what I'm doing as a teacher when I go in, and I know what's expected of me, and there's a sense of like, okay, he's up there, and then we're looking at him from down there or whatever. Um, so then, if that's true, is there a certain management style that you have for the table? Is there like a certain footprint that you have when you run a game? Are there certain traits, like if someone shows up for a Shanna Germain game, is it going to get a lot of
Yeah.
kung fu action, or is he going to get like, or like what's going to happen? Like,
My hope, and this is the goal. I certainly don't claim to have always achieved this. My hope is that I believe my job as the GM is to give players the best of whatever it is they're looking for. And so I'm very, very off the cuff. I'm very ad lib. I try to read what my players are interested in and what they're asking for, and kind of go, because I can make a story on the fly. I feel like I try to go where they're like, oh, that's a cool rock. I'm like, oh, okay, rock matters. Like let's go that direction. And so I think like my answer was going to be chaos, but I don't think it feels like chaos. Hopefully, not to the players, because the players are kind of driving the story, even though they don't know it per se. I don't do very well with like a pre-published adventure because I can't kind of stay on the track because I'm like,
yeah,
oh, but this would be cool too.
yeah,
Even though I think they're great and they're awesome, especially if you're beginning, or if you think a different way about jamming, there's such a good thing. But I feel like I'm just too ad lib to kind of work with that. So I guess I try to go where my players want to go. Sometimes it makes absolute chaos and creates
yeah,
confusion at the table, and like hopefully among the characters and not among the players.
yeah.
But
So then in that, kind of with that maybe in mind, then, do you think that is there any strength having come from having done so much writing and have such a tremendous body of work? Like, I often talk to writers, and I'll ask them, well, how many drafts do you do? And the writers that are starting out will tell me, oh, I do 3, 4, 5, 10, 15 drafts. But I'll talk to someone else, and they'll just look at me. I don't draft anymore. I just write it, and then they'll go through it. But they kind of have there's a sense of like understanding of how things are supposed to move. Did you find any lessons, or was there any relationship, say, between like writing prose and poetry and then playing off the cuff? Does being a better writer make you a better GM to play off the cuff?
but writing for me is such a different process than telling a story. But I do know that when I was in college, I was a bartender, and I had this friend who could tell an amazing story about anything that happened. It didn't matter how boring the experience was. Like he was once telling a story about shaking a bottle of ketchup and the cap came off, and I'll never forget that story because he was such a good storyteller that
Yeah.
I was just enraptured. And I realized around that time, probably after listening to his stories, that I wasn't a good storyteller. I didn't understand how to tell a story verbally,
Yeah.
even though I read a lot and I wrote a lot. And so I kind of embarked on this adventure to better my storytelling ability. And I think that out of anything might be one of the things that really helped me jam, because I felt like I sort of pinpointed the places in which I told bad stories
Hmm.
and kind of tried to break that down. And it really made a big difference. I suspect, as much reading, I love movies, I love games, I love TV, like I love stories in general. So I suspect that like having a life filled with stories is valuable in that way. But I do think jamming allows you a lot more leeway, right? You can just you don't have to quite tie everything up so nicely along the way, as long as you have like this amazing finale kind of experience that ties some of the things in, and that's a lot easier than writing.
Yes. Well, yes, and I actually totally agree with that because I feel like so I had another guest on the program a few weeks ago, and they were saying that game mastering is very forgiving.
Mm.
And I think that's true, like because there's so many times when I think back to games, there are moments where I say something off the cuff and I think, oh my God, that doesn't make any sense because of X, Y, and Z happened on these episodes, and then next week I was going to do this. And it's sort of like my players don't really remember that. They remember the points that break above the water, which are the highlights of the game, the moments that, and they're more they sort of go with the flow, even though when I come to my finale and everything seems to explode and wrap up, they're also sort of like that was fantastic, and they don't remember the 17 flaws and contradictions in my story that I just glossed over and am scratching out busily in my notebook, so no one ever finds evidence of it. Do you?
Players are good like that.
They are, yes. Do you still play privately then, or is it all kind of play testing all the way down? It's just play test,
Oh
play
no,
test, play test.
we've had an ongoing, we had two invisible back-to-back sun two back-to-back invisible sun games that
Cool.
went I don't know, 4 years total maybe. And then we just took a break from that and are now playing another game. We play every 2 weeks. We actually just
Hmm.
went back to Numenera, which is fun
Oh,
because we haven't played Numenera in a long time.
yeah.
So, I would say at least a couple of times a month that isn't playtesting, which is pretty good considering the COVID space that we're in.
Yeah.
I really, really like to I really love one shots of brand new games, things I haven't played before. And so that's something I'm trying to work to bring back into my life because that kind of fell out of the way with no conventions and all that kind of stuff. So that's something that I'm certainly missing right now is the chance to just pick up and play some cool new thing that looks
Right.
amazing.
Right. Yeah. I feel like again, when I talk to a lot of creators, they'll often tell me that they're so busy with their design and then they have playtest time and all of that that some of that the desire to or the ability to play multiple games either consumes them because then all they do is they play a game once or twice, they love it, and then they set it aside because the new one comes out, or they like kind of get hooked on one and they're not able to catch up. Um,
It's certainly streaky. Like it depends on how much I have going on in my life and all that kind of stuff too.
right. So what was it like then when Monty's like, well, I got this little thing. It's called Numenera, and I don't know. It probably won't do very well. We'll see. We're gonna kickstart it. Like, what is it like when you're sitting down with this world, this setting? And I have to be honest, everyone, I'm very biased here, and I'm not saying this because she's just on the program, but Numenera is like my favorite setting of all time, in my opinion. And here now I'm gonna do an ad for this game. There are very few games that I often can think of outside of gaming. I look at
Mm.
something and I say, this is a setting. This is a great setting. And I'm not going to mention what they are, but there are many ones. Some of them big, some of them small. I look at them and I think this is a setting. It's not really a place. It's not something I want to go to. I want to envision. Um, I think Numenera was the first, and as far as I know, it's the only game that's really, really, really made me feel like I'm kind of home. It feels to me, it's kind of like the way I loved Star Wars, and I grew up with Star Wars, and there are very few games. So what is it like when he presents this to you, or are you sitting down talking about it, or what was that first like putting your toe in the RPG editing waters like?
I have to admit that it was like 11 years ago. So
Oh, good. You can't.
I barely remember that experience. But I do remember just sort of falling in love with the fact that I could work on a world that didn't require a plot. That was
Right.
really fun. And that like I don't think I had understood how much I loved world building
Yeah.
until I got to work on Numenera, because I didn't like I mean it's so I mean you can make up the language and the mountains
Yeah.
and the culture and
Yeah.
you can scrap everything that already exists in our brains and our religion and our just everything. You can just sort of create this amazing thing from scratch. And so it certainly kicked off or reinvigorated or something, this like amazing love of building worlds, of creating that kind of stuff, because it was just pure freedom. I didn't have to play by any rules. Like, I don't know, it was a really, really wonderful experience in that way. And of course there was, the Kickstarter did way, way
I
better than
know.
we thought we were going to do. So there was like this sort of panic too, because we didn't have a company at the time, right? It was just the two of us. We thought we were just going to write and edit and send out some books. And like suddenly, we owed a lot of books to a lot of
Right.
people. And
Right.
I can remember having this discussion of Monty with like, are we going to start a company? Like that's a
Yeah.
big commitment. And if we start it and hire people, we have to be all in. Like this is a big deal. And so, there were some times where we spent a lot of time talking about that and figuring that out, and where we or weren't we, and how to do the right thing, and that
Right.
was unexpected.
What was the process? I mean, I know you mentioned it's 11 years ago, and I don't want to, it's not. I'm curious, but like, were you suddenly like, oh my goodness, we're starting our own company now? This is more than I'd bargained for, or were you like, yeah, let's go do it, or
Both of those things before we made a decision, right? Like it's like when you prepare for a trip and you're trying to figure out like, oh my God, do I have everything? What else do I need? Like,
right,
did I turn the stove off? Right. And then as soon as you get on the plane or, in the bus or whatever, you're just like, okay, I can't worry anymore, because here we go. And so all those things happened before we made that decision. It was like, are we doing this? What are the, I mean, we understood the just how important it was to
mm-hmm.
make the right decision and to make sure that we understood as much as we could about what we would get into if we started it. And so, yeah, I mean, we had a lot of deep discussions about what that looked like, and what was a good, solid wage for people, and could we afford health
Right,
insurance? We didn't want to start a
right,
company if we couldn't give people health insurance and 401ks and like all those kinds of things. What did that cost? And so, I mean, there was a lot. There was a lot of like, how do if we were going to do this, and if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right.
yeah,
And can
yeah,
we do that? Can we afford to do that? And is this a thing we want to commit to? So, I mean, there was a lot of conversations ahead of time about whether or not that was the route that we wanted to go. So,
right.
but once we decided, it was like, this is the right decision. We absolutely, we jumped in with both feet, and we kind of just went forward and
Yeah.
haven't looked back, I guess. So,
And and am I correct in that? And I might have this impression wrong. I'm just kind of guessing a little bit here. Does everybody? There's no physical like headquarters. There's no secret
no,
headquarters. Everybody works from home, and it's
yeah.
is everybody like in the same area, or are you kind of spread
We're
out over?
No, we're spread out all over. We
Oh,
do have four of our team is in Seattle, because Seattle is full of amazing game designers and amazing game design companies.
yeah,
And so
exactly.
Bruce, Sean, myself, and Monty are all here in Seattle.
Okay.
We have a team that's in Kansas City. Like our, one of our co-owners is in
Yep.
Kansas City, and Tammy, who does like
Hmm.
everything for this company. Like I can't even explain it how she
Yeah.
does this company's in
Yeah.
Kansas City, as well as our art director. And then we have someone who's on the East Coast, and then we have someone in Canada. So we have, we sort of have people all over. We created the company out of the gate that way because we wanted to hire the best people and not make them give up their lives to come and
Mm.
work for us, because we also understand that particularly creators, although I think that this is true for lots of people, not everyone on our team, but like people benefit from being able to work in their own space, being
Yeah.
able to not have an office where people are going to interrupt them. We talk a lot about deep work and the ability to kind of close yourself off from all the interruptions and the questions and the sort of constant need so that you can create amazing things. And so it just felt like the right thing. We do have some extroverts on the team who I think would really love it if we had,
Yeah.
if we
Well, I was
had
going
an
to ask,
office.
do you ever miss like everybody going to the bar on a Friday night or something? Or
The social stuff is one of the things we're missing. Like we just hired Latia, who's amazing,
yeah.
and I haven't met her yet. And like
Yeah, it's so
because of
interesting,
COVID,
isn't
right?
it? Isn't it? It's
Usually we have a summit, and we all get together and spend a week together doing amazing things and planning for the future. And we haven't had one of those because of COVID, and we haven't gone to conventions. And so we were doing movie nights virtually for a while, and that was really fun and great. And we often have like Friday afternoon cocktails where we get together on Zoom. But
that's cool.
I will say that it has worked so well. And then I think the pandemic is making it a little bit harder for us to feel like a cohesive unit in the social aspect. And I deeply miss that.
Right.
I'm looking forward to figuring out a way around that, whatever that looks like.
So then what is your, if everybody's kind of off on their own and obviously they're kind of like in their environments and they're able to create at their maximum potential because they're super comfy. What is the creative process look like? Maybe even just for yourself, for example. Like, do you sit down at 9 o'clock and have your coffee and you get to work, or is it like, I'll slide into work at 10:30 and then
Well, one of the great things about having a distributed company is that people are allowed to set their own hours, because we really feel strongly that, like, especially like if you're, no matter who you are, you have hours that are best for you, and you know what they are, right? So we have some real night owls on the team. Like if Monty has his druthers, he doesn't start working till 9 p.m., right? And he that's his magic time.
wow, okay.
And so, and because we're on different coasts and we have different time zones, right?
Yeah.
Like there's all kinds of reasons for that. So everyone works totally differently. We are very much like, you don't have to check, we have sort of regular hours where we have Slack open kind of, but mostly we're like, take the day off for your health if you need it, do whatever you need. Like as long as you're doing your work and you feel supported and happy, like
Right.
we have no expectations that you're going to be at your desk from X time to X time. So like I can talk about my schedule if that's of interest.
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah, I'd love to.
Um,
You're the guest. I don't see any other guests
well,
here. Do you?
everyone's creative experience is so different. So my goal is I work in 45-minute stints because that's where my brain is best. I know that like some people work in like they need 3 or 4 hours and that's where their brain is best. But I have sort of discovered I can focus for 45 minutes. It's kind of perfect. So I usually get up and I do 2 45-minute stints in the morning. And then I walk the dog and go to yoga because I have a bad back and that's the only way I can sit in a chair. My goal is 5 45-minute stints a day, because I also have a lot of like meetings and emails and all that kind of stuff, which takes up a lot of my other time. So 5 45-minute stints a day. The first 2, like I said, happen almost always from sort of like 8 to 10, something like that. And then the other 3 are open. It really depends on what I've got going on. Like I just did one before we started this. And I try to be really flexible with myself and really give myself this sort of ability to do it when I'm at my best. I'm not my best at night. I start getting really tired. And so one of the things that I know is if I don't do my 45-minute stints earlier in the day, I have to do one at 9 or 10 or whatever, and it's just derogatory. Like I'm just
Right.
so bad at it. Like, I can't even think. I got like 2 words down, and it's just a waste of 45 minutes. But I force myself to do it because then I can, I know better and do them during the day. So that's my creative process is pretty all over the board, but that's my main goal is to do that.
Is that generally for a project that you approach? So if you're writing a novel, say, or a short story, 45-minute stints and then a break and then 45 minutes, and that's just the best way for you to access the creative aspect of
Yeah,
it.
it really is. After 45 minutes, I start thinking about Twitter or
Yeah.
my email, or maybe I need a snack. And so I've just sort of capped it at that, because at that point I usually feel like I could keep going, and so that, like, leaving it when I feel like I could keep going is a good place, as opposed to, oh, I just spent the last 10 minutes, looking at Twitter and now I feel awful.
Right.
So
Yes, right. You just get up and go, because otherwise, like, you're just stuck there. And then I know what you're saying. You've got that, like, that regret where you're like, oh my goodness, what have I just done
right,
with 20
right.
minutes of my
And there's
life?
something joyous about that timer going off at 45 minutes, and you're just like, yes, I've
Yeah.
accomplished the thing,
Do you
right?
set it? Do you literally do you set a timer or anything like
Oh
that?
yeah.
Oh,
I set a
cool.
timer on my phone. Yep.
Right.
Because like the truth is like 45 minutes is like is actually pushing me a little. And so like usually I'll be like, is it 45 minutes up yet? And I'll look
Yeah.
at the clock and it's like 5 minutes of. And those last 5 minutes, something magical sometimes happens, right? And
Right.
so the fact that I have to sit there for 5 more minutes, or sometimes it's half an hour more when I'm just like, something magical happens and you sit and you just do the work. And that's, I guess, the biggest lesson I've learned about being a creative is you just have to sit there and do the magic. And I don't know, that's the only way I know how to get it done.
How are you? How is everyone kind of collaborating on your projects then? Are you kind of sending them back and forth, or are you sometimes like you're both sort of in a window together and you're looking at a piece of writing or something and you're commenting on it, or I don't even really know quite what to ask there, but like, what's the collaborative process like maybe for at MCG or
Well, it's
in
interesting because there's lots of different ways to collaborate, right? So you could have a project in which two creators or two designers or more are collaborating. And in that process, it's often a lot of conversation before the writing begins about what the book is and what it entails, kind of, and like back and forth about like, well, here's what I'm thinking about the table of contents and the layout. And like, here's what I think that, readers or gamers might really want to have. So there's a lot of conversation before the project even begins. And that's usually with the whole design team. Like the
yeah.
whole design team is on board saying like, hey, here's some cool ideas. Here's what we need. Right. And then there's always a main designer of a project who kind of runs that show. And everyone's different. Collaboration is different with everyone. I'm not a good collaborator. I'm learning to be better. Because I just tend to go off and do the work, and
Hmm.
that creates problems. And like Bruce and I just collaborated on first responders, and we're both like that. We both just go away and do the work. And so I think we both really had to try very hard to be like, okay, here's what I'm working on. What do you think of this? And in the end, it was great. We had such a good time working on that book. But it was also like a little bit rocky because we just don't do it very often.
Hmm.
Because both of our natural styles are just go away and write the thing. But other people are a lot. Sean's very collaborative through the whole process. He's a great communicator. He really likes to be kind of upfront and let you know what he's working on. That's great. And then after the design part, everything gets collaborative again, right? There's collaborative playtesting, which everyone, on the design team does. Sometimes it's bigger than that. And then, of course, the editor gets involved, and the editor works really closely with the designer, and that's collaborative in a whole different way. And then ditto with, the layout. Bear works with the designers really closely in both the art orders and,
I
sort of
love
how
his
the book
layouts.
looks.
I
So
love
great.
I love his layouts. Like I feel like this sort of thing doesn't get like shout outs enough.
Yeah.
But what I like is I like his layouts so much that I'm so sorry I've copied them for like my own stuff because they remind me so much of the textbooks that I use as a teacher. And some of them are crappy, but there are some good ones. And they've got like, the notes in the margins that sort of they're like the hyperlinks, if you will, where you can just, you can move between sections and the call outs, and I don't know what the publishing terms are. I just know what I call them like when I'm teaching. His layouts are really phenomenal, and I like the stuff that he does a lot. I like the whole look of like the whole line is very consistent and it's a good it's simple, but I know it's not really simple because I've tried to do it
Yeah.
myself with my own
True.
stuff, but it's really nice.
I'm
Um,
gonna close the blind. Hold on just one second.
oh yeah, sure.
The sun is
Okay,
setting.
don't worry.
Absolutely
I'm just
blinding
gonna
me.
kill time for a moment while Shanna Germain closes the
Okay,
blind on the other side of her desk. There we go.
there we go.
Cool. So you
Much
had
better.
mentioned no problem at all. You had mentioned that you're playtesting, and I assume you're playtesting for the Devil Made Us Do It products, the Devil's Dandy. I know you were doing Devil's Dandy Dogs
I am.
just like a week or so ago. I think you had tweeted about how's that going?
It's great. It's a whole new game for us because it uses tarot cards and funky dice, and So, like when you show up at the playtest, you're like, okay, team, here's what I think. Let's try this. And then you just sort of have to like expect your heart to get broken multiple times because you want the game to be better and you've got to be open to that. And that's what happens. And it's awesome. And so some things worked really, really great. And then this other idea that I had, Monty and the team were just like, that totally does not work. And now I have a thing that works so much better. So it's actually one of my favorite parts. And I think if you have a team that you can trust to give you really solid feedback and suggestions, which we absolutely do, they love games. They want the game to be better. They're not at all worried about like, stabbing you in the face, which is great.
That's good quality in a coworker. They're not going to stab you in the face.
And we all trust each other that like nobody's gonna walk away mad from those kinds of critiques and feedbacks. And so like, so we try it out, we see what works. We're gonna have another playtest for Devil's Dandy Dogs in a couple of weeks as I've revamped things. And some things require a lot more playtesting than others. Like first responders required, I think we did a bunch of playtests for that because it just, we were creating this whole thing where you're like fighting a fire, which is really different than fighting a creature. And, how does that work? And like, what are the, how is that fun? How do we make that fun and interesting and useful? And, we went through a bunch of iterations with that idea before we finally found one that was like fun and cool and interesting. But it took us a while, and that's the joy of playtest is you get to make all your mistakes before it's public.
Can I ask you, and I've asked this of other creators, and I'm kind of interested to get different perspectives on this. So many times I hear the word playtest thrown around, and so I'm not always. I think it might have a slightly different meaning for everybody, but could you give me like a little example of what you mean? Like, are you talking about playtesting a mechanic where you kind of like say, okay, let's see what's going to happen when this monster fights a level or a tier 3 whatever explorer or something, or is it other stuff like how about this description that I wrote for this particular room as you enter it? How do you have an example maybe, or could you give us an idea of what that is?
Yeah, I mean, and so one of the important parts about playtesting, in my opinion, is knowing what you're asking for. Like it's sort of like getting a novel critique or kind of any other critique, right? And so we test various things. And so, for example, you might say, hey, here's my write-up of how to create a character in this game. When you read it and try to make a character, does it make sense? Let me know if you have feedback. Right. Are there places where you stumbled? Are there places where the language doesn't make sense? Do you have any other suggestions? So sometimes it's reading something and then executing it on your own. Did that work? Sometimes it's getting together with the whole group and running an adventure. And in that case, sometimes we're playtesting the adventure, but sometimes we're playtesting the mechanics. Sometimes we're trying to playtest both, which is really tricky. I mean, playtesting more than like a couple of things in a single session can get kind of overwhelming because you don't know what you're supposed to focus on. And so we typically come to the team and say, hey, here's what I have. Here's what we're going to do. Here's what I'm really interested in getting feedback on, but feedback on anything is totally okay. And often it depends, like when I run playtests, I like to do it where we can break the experience a little bit. So like if we're running an adventure and we get to a place where it's broken, it's not working, I'm happy to stop the sort of game at that point and talk about it because it's not really a game. You're not trying to give the players the experience in that way. But other people like to play test where they run the whole thing through and then say after, okay, let's talk about it. And so it's really different for every different product and every different person, I think. But the main goal, I think, is to know where you think things are broken or know what you want to, specifically what you want to play test, but then being open to like other things that don't work. Like sometimes, you're like, here's a thing I'm really worried about. It doesn't seem like it's working. And it turns out that's working great, but something else is completely broken.
Right. So then with that idea kind of in mind, is there anything, do you think, like the process of playtesting and designing and writing all of this stuff out, and this might be an awkward or weird question, but like, do you ever feel like you've kind of learned something either about yourself or about kind of what the world around you, like has looking at a rule set or looking at the way something is presented in a game ever taught you something about maybe how you think the brain works or how you work maybe as a person or?
Well, I mean, I think that's the great thing about gaming and stories in general, right? Is if you are open to that experience of growth. I mean, stories and games, they're such a perfect, I mean, they're just such a fertile field for personal experience and personal growth and changes in how we see ourselves and each other in the world. Like, I mean, it's one of the reasons I love and advocate for games. I think that they're just such a beautiful learning tool in all kinds of ways. From the sort of social aspect we were talking about earlier to, sort of discovering, like so many people that I know have discovered their sexuality or their gender or
Right.
something else about themselves through gaming, through playing a character who's totally different than they think they are, and then discovering that there's this shared element. And I think that's awesome. So yeah, I mean, I think I hope so. I hope that's always true. That I'm having that. I mean, I hope that's true of everything I do, right? That it's
Yeah.
it's creating growth in me. But I know that's not important to everyone. So, there's probably people for whom that happens only sometimes and it's a surprise. But I try to be deeply introspective, and I try to think about, like, if something goes wrong in a game, why it felt wrong to me, or if something is awesome, like, why was it so awesome? Why did I love it so much? What was the joy there? How can I repeat that either as a gamer, or as a designer, or as a novelist? So yeah, I mean, it's just full of that for me.
Right. And I asked this because I know that, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were lead designer on No Thank You Evil, is that correct?
It was co-design. Monte and I
Co-design.
co-designed it.
Okay.
We didn't really have a lead designer on that one.
Oh, okay, got it. Uh, because to me, the idea of an educational game, because I have actually, I've been using the Numenera and Cipher System actually and D&D 5. I actually started using I used D&D 5e for a long time, and then I switched to using Cipher System, just because of the narrative aspects of it. And when I saw that there was that MCG had also created No Thank You Evil, where I was just like, oh my goodness, this I've got to get this for the class. Where did the idea for that come from? Was it just because it seems like out of nowhere, but on the other hand, it does sort of make some sense in a way. Like, where did that idea come from, and what was it like working on that?
I'm super interested in the came out of nowhere idea, because that's an interesting perspective. But
Do you think it didn't come? Do you think it makes a lot of sense? You know, I
I
can I
I
can
guess
see it. I can see it in retrospect. Like a month, like if I look back and I say, oh well, look at all their games. Look at how they're set up. Like their games are designed like a textbook. They're also very thoughtful in a way. Like they're a lot about ideas. They're about like if I look at the interactive, not interactive, but if I'm looking at like the text of one or something as a teacher, I might think these are set up to like help people learn and understand how to play the game. So to me, it felt a little bit out of nowhere, but I mean, I totally welcomed it. But
that's interesting. I think that's really cool. So what happened was we had a bunch of families who were playing Numenera with their kids, and they were having to crank the setting way down, because the setting
mm,
is really kind of dark in Numenera, right? And they were having great experience, and, like, we were getting these amazing, like, amazing letters from kids, or, like, war moth, cutouts from kids who were, like, having these cool experiences in Numenera. And a couple of things happened. One was that, like, we realized that there was this generation of players out there who were having kids and who were playing role-playing games with their kids. And I mean, that wasn't something I would have ever had the opportunity to do with my parents. It just wasn't really done.
yeah.
And so that was really cool. And so we just started thinking about how to, how to help facilitate this amazing opportunity to play role-playing games with your kids without having to be so experienced that you were already playing an adult game and knew how to break it and knew how to bring the setting to a different level. And so then we started exploring, what is fun about role-playing games. We certainly didn't set out to make it educational in any way. We set out to make it accessible. We
Hmm.
wanted kids to be able to play, to want to play, to not have to do a ton of math, to not have to do a ton of reading, to not have to, like, I mean, we sort of, when we talked about designing, we talked about that we were competing with puppies. So, like, if you've got a bunch of kids at a table playing role-playing games and there's
Right.
puppies in the room,
Right.
how amazing can you make this game so that
Right.
they're not going to go play with the puppies instead?
Yeah.
Or how can you incorporate the puppies? So that was sort of where we started with that game, was just sort of thinking about how to make it easy for parents to role play with their kids, because lots of people seem to want to, and how to make it easy for kids to do this thing.
Yeah.
And to sort of get involved without, the goal was to bring the hurdles down as low as we
Yeah.
could for all kinds of kids.
I guess in that's a very fair point. You mentioned not necessarily educational, but accessible, and I would say that that's an extremely fair point. And in that respect, it's not out of nowhere because if you think about the cipher system, the whole thing is meant to sort of break those walls down, make it very accessible, so that it's very malleable. And so, point taken. I stand corrected, ladies
No,
and
I think it's a cool insight, right? I mean, we didn't know we were going to make it, so it
gentlemen.
certainly came as a shock to us. So,
Well, I love it, and I love, like I was saying, I use my kids cheered when I played the short film that was made for the Kickstarter. Like I didn't know
that's awesome.
that you had made that. I didn't know that MCG had made that, and I was like just looking around one day. I'm like, what is this? Did somebody make a fan film or something? And I clicked on it. I'm
Aw,
like, oh my gosh, it's an official, it's canon. And
that's
I didn't
cool.
tell the kids what we were doing, and I said, all right, everybody, we got 10 minutes left or 15 minutes or whatever it was. We're going to watch a movie. They're like, yay. And then it comes on the screen and they're like talking to each other. I think, what is this? What's going on? And they got it. They were just like cheered when they saw that.
Aw, that's so cool.
Yeah,
I
they loved
love
it.
that
They
so much.
totally loved it. So then with that kind of in mind there, so the idea, and we're kind of shifting gears here a little bit, but I find you to be fairly like from reading your Twitter feed and from like just sort of like reading things that you've written, you seem fairly kind of like candid and sort of open about who you are and what your opinions are and that sort of thing. Would it be fair to say you're kind of an open person, or is the introvert in you hiding something from us, or what do you? No,
I love how devious that sounds.
I'm.
Um, I think that one of the interesting things about introverts or all people is right that we have these places where we feel really comfortable. And I'm much more comfortable writing than I am speaking. So writing is sort of my place of coming from the heart. I also think that like I have this philosophy that you only live once and you don't get to be here for very long. And sort of hiding parts of who you are is a
Yeah.
painful thing. And there's been a whole process of like you keep learning that over and over and over again in your life, or at least I do, right? Like when I knew I was bisexual from the time that I was very young, and I grew up in an era where you weren't allowed to be a feminist if you were femme, if you were femme presenting. Like that's how long ago this was, and bisexuality was definitely a thing where you just couldn't decide. And
Hmm.
and I sort of at that time started to feel like I need to be really present and public as this sort of I was probably 18 or 19 or 20, as in this place where I'm like very, open about who I am, and I'm showing other people that there are people like me out there in the world. And I've sort of carried that philosophy the whole way. I mean, that happened to me when I came out as a sex writer. Like I never wrote under a pseudonym. I was
Hmm.
very open about it because I didn't want people to be ashamed. And
Right.
and I feel like the more you see people normalize things, whatever that is, and as a white woman, I have a lot of privilege and power, and I feel very obligated to use that to I don't know, just be a presence, right? Be a presence for other people who are questioning who they are, who are trying to find their ground. I feel like I try to be very open about those kinds of things. That's just very, very important to me. On the other
It,
hand, right, it's the internet, and so I'm not putting my address out there or
right.
anything.
Well, but in the same way though that there are those we were talking about when you were like in your early 20s or mid 20s, and there's something that keeps you going to do that, to like put yourself out there and continue to move forward, and you break through and you do it. There are lots of people, I think, it would be very fair to say, and I know this just as simply as a teacher, there are lots of people that want to be more open and honest and be themselves. Is there something, do you think, about yourself that is a little bit different, or there's something about you that's a little stronger, or maybe a little looks at things from a different perspective that allows you to be open and just honest
You know,
about it.
yeah, I
Like
think,
if you're, for
yeah,
example, going to give advice to somebody that's like, well, I kind of want to say, and it
yeah,
doesn't necessarily have to be, sexuality. It could be so many other things,
for
preferences,
sure.
likes, all that stuff. There's so many things in our lives that we often don't kind of come out about. Like if someone's asking you for advice, do you think there's something that you sort of stick to that helps
Um,
you out with that, or?
it's it's such a there's so many things, right? One is just age, right? The older I get, the more I do not give a
Mm-hmm.
fuck, which is lovely.
Mm-hmm.
And I sort of am very much forward looking to sort of the second half of my life post 50 to see how much that even continues to go. So some
Right.
of that is, you live through some shit, right? And you start to understand that the only thing you can control is who you are, and that's it, right? You can't control other people's reactions to you. You can't control whether they're going to love you or hate you or yell at you on the internet or
Right.
whatever the thing is, right? Kick you out. I mean, and it's a very fine line, right? Because it can be really dangerous, right, to be who you are, because our culture is not always accepting. We're seeing that, of course, right now with by people of color in particular. Like this is just such a tough it's tough. And so like I can only speak from my own perspective, which again is pretty damn privileged as a white woman, to be able to be who I am and to be out there about that. And I would say, like, find your people, find the people that love and support you, who stand behind you, who protect you, who inspire you. And I guess, like, if you can find those people, which of course is a whole thing in itself, like how do we do that? It's such a complicated space. um but build that group around you so that you can start being who you are in a small space. Like if it feels scary to be who you are in a big space, practice that with yourself, practice that with your best friend. It's a process, right? It doesn't happen all at once. We all have secrets that no matter how open we are and how
Right.
honest we are, there's always something we're ashamed of
Yeah.
or concerned about or worried about, right? And so I think just little bit by little bit, finding out who you are, doing some introspective work, asking those tough questions, and then finding courage in whatever safe spaces you can find it. I don't know if that's useful or not, but
No,
it sort of feels like my journey.
it's not supposed to necessarily be useful. I'm just curious to hear what your idea is. Do you feel like you've become stronger in this way over the years, like as you've grown older,
Oh
or
yeah.
you think it's changed? I mean, um,
Yeah, for sure. I think that it's the whole idea of living the examined life, right?
mm,
You grow with every experience if you put a little bit of time and focus into that. And I was just talking to a friend and saying, like, one of the things that is my current sort of process of growth is finishing things. I really like new things. I love the excitement of new things. I hate finishing things. It's boring and stressful, and it's just one of those things that, like, I'm just not good at. Sticking with things has never been my strength. And I would say, like, the last 5 years in particular, that's been a real focus of, like, just how do I learn to stick with things? How do I learn to grow? And when things get hard, how do I stay in this space? And so I feel like there's always something new that life is going to throw at you. And you can either continually buckle under that, or you can do the hard work. And I guess, mostly I've become a fan of doing the hard work. There's nothing more satisfying than doing the thing that you're just like, oh, this sucks so much. I
right,
hate this
right.
so much. Why am I doing this? But at the same time, like, that's the most satisfying experience you can possibly have when you get to the other side of
Coming
that.
through
And
the
you're
other
like,
side. Yeah.
yeah, I've done this thing that I didn't know that I could do. And so I've become a fan of that, particularly in the last 5 or 10 years.
How was this is kind of a sideways way of sliding into a different question here, but how is creating We Are All Mad Here? Was
Mm.
because I mean I love the idea of kind of the myth and the fantasy behind it, and to me, like when I saw that book was coming out, I was like, ooh, like I like this idea of kind of using. To me, the first thing I thought of when I saw it was I was just like, oh, there's so many ways to kind of explore myth and fantasy as a reflection kind of as of like who we are. And where'd you get the idea for that, and how was developing that?
So one of the things I love about MCG is that we're creator driven, by which I mean, like, when we are like, hey, we're going to do a Kickstarter, the first question is, what do we all want to make? Right. Which I love so much. We never do a Kickstarter that's like, we should probably make one of these. So I can
Right.
remember we were sitting around the design team was in Seattle, and we were sitting around our back porch, and we were saying, we're thinking about doing a Kickstarter, and Sean had been really enamored of doing a horror book,
Yes,
and
he
I
told
knew
me this.
Monty had a fantasy idea,
Yeah.
and so we're sitting around the table, and Monty's like, all right, well, if we were going to do a genre Kickstarter, like, what are the genres that you guys want to do? And so I had sort of been thinking about this fairy tale idea for a while, and we were throwing out names, and like, we got The Stars Are Fire from Shakespeare, and we were
Hmm.
just sort of, and I said, I really want to call this book We Are All Mad Here, because I have very long loved Alice in Wonderland and stuff like that. And I said, but if we do it that way, like, we have to include mental illness as part of the book. And what would that look like?
This is
And
this
so
is huge for me, and this is what I really want to hear about. This is what I'm getting at.
we realized that we had this really interesting opportunity. And I can remember that conversation because it's a very scary space to start introducing a topic that's so difficult and so complicated and so kind of taboo still. And to introduce it in a way where we're talking about mythos and fairy tales. I mean, it was just this whole, like, can we even do this? Like,
Yeah.
can we do this right? Can we give this its due? And sort of as we were sitting around talking, we were talking about our own experiences with things like depression and anxiety, and like, just sort of how, as humans, all of us are struggling with something, right? We're all struggling in some way. And I have a background, I have a degree in psychology. And so it was specifically with an interest in post-traumatic stress. And so we were kind of like, if anybody's going to write this book, like, I'm someone who's really interested in it. Like, could we do it well? I felt pretty confident that I'm pretty good at writing about sensitive topics. I've
Mm.
had some experience with that kind of thing. But we still had a lot of, like, we still had a lot of questions of, like, how to do it right, above and beyond the obvious things like getting sensitivity readers, which of course we did, but like, how to make it matter to the game and the setting, and not just sort of something that's tacked on. So it was a really complicated book to sort of conceptualize
Yeah.
early on, because we wanted to do it right, and we certainly didn't want to offer, like, we didn't want to penalize the players or the characters for having, for living with mental illness. We didn't, or being
Yeah.
touched by mental illness. We didn't want it to be, and now you're magic and it's all solved, because those of us who've suffered things, we know that's not how it works, right? Some days you're like, I'm not getting out of bed. That's not
Right.
happening.
Right.
And there is no sort of magic solving, right? And so we were like, how do we make it so that this is a thing that you are both brought up and brought down by, right? And the whole process is learning to live with the things that are neurodivergent in your brain. And so we kind of started from that place, from that really empathetic place of, like, this isn't simple, it is complex. We're going to honor that complexity and honor the sort of work that we do to live with, mental illness in whatever way that is for each of us. I'm really happy with how it came out. We worked very, very hard to sort of, I don't know, and of course you also have to make it fun, which, like,
Yeah. Well, yeah,
that's
right.
really, which is a
Yeah.
whole thing, right? Like, mental illness is fun. I don't like that. Like, suffering from depression. What the hell? This is
But
a bad idea.
it's really interesting though that you say this, because it's something I've been sort of thinking a lot about myself as a GM. Um, Mental illness, isn't fun. There's a lot of stuff out there that isn't fun, and yet we will go and watch a film or read a book or television show. And when we go through that, ideally, if it's something good, we are transformed by the end of it. Problem isn't necessarily solved. Problem isn't, perfect or anything. And maybe there are many other things to unfold out of it or unpack out of it, right? But we feel a bit transformed, even if it's just a very small step in a certain direction where we're like, now we're one step closer to being honest or understanding or something like that. And so to me, this sort of ties into your consent in gaming. Uh, I don't know if you uh, form. I'm not sure if you call it form or a packet or whatever.
I think
Um,
we just call it PF. But there is a form that's part of that, yeah.
Right. So it kind of ties into that. And I'm thinking as a teacher, I would never tell one of my students, we're not going to talk about that.
Right.
What I might do is say, okay, let's talk about this separately outside because this is something that we're going to talk about on our own. And the same thing, like the idea of being, say, open about sexuality or open about um, likes and dislikes and open about who you are, no matter what it is. I feel that it's important to talk, even when you make mistakes or you say something. I've said, stupid things 437 times today. But the thing that allows me to continue to say stupid things is that at least I think, I try to say them in a way that's open to someone correcting me on them or open to someone steering me a little bit in another direction. And what I think is remarkable about this idea of mental illness in the game is you're opening up discussions to talk. Between people, they can talk about it, and I think this is a really wonderful direction to take games in, and I'd like to see more games kind of go in that direction. In a kind, sensitive, and genuinely honest way to move forward. So in that respect, I'm impressed with just the idea that someone would attempt something like
Mm.
this. And yeah, that's not a question.
That's nice to hear. Thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah, and I agree. It would be great to have even more, more of, I mean, there's some great indie games out there. Like it's just full of great indie games that are opening these amazing conversations. And oh my gosh, like I mean, I feel like there are generations younger than I am who are just doing like mind-blowingly brave games. And I
Yes.
love that so much.
Yes. Well,
Love
I
it
don't
so much.
I don't know if you know it. Amit Moshe, who's the developer of the City of Mist role-playing
Mm.
game, has just came out with or he's working on a game called Queers, which is really interesting, and it's about, and I don't want to sum it up, but it's a very interesting game, and I'm so sorry. I know this is an MCG chat, but
No,
you
that's
should,
great.
everybody, you should go
All
out there
ages.
and
Oh
check it
yeah.
out.
Oh
Check out City of Mist, and then from there you can find a Meet, and then you can find Queers and all
yeah.
of that stuff. It's really interesting because it's sort of a Power Rangers meets battling stereotypes kind of game. It's very fascinating. Um,
That's awesome.
Small question: do you think role-playing games can change the world?
I do. I really do. I mean, it sounds kind of cliche, but like I believe stories change the world, right? And role-playing games are just stories where we're asked to have even more empathy. And holy crap, if empathy isn't the thing that's going to change the world, I don't know what is, right?
Yeah.
Empathy for everything, everyone, just difficult spaces and life is hard. Like, why make it harder? Like it just doesn't make sense to me. So yeah, I do. I mean, you have to like they're not going to change the world by themselves, right? People have to do the work too. You
Hmm.
have to be willing to do that. You have to be willing to be open-hearted and enter the table as a space of compassion and teamwork and camaraderie and equality and all those things. It doesn't happen for free. Like we have to do the work, but I do think it does. Whether that's opening conversations about difficult topics or getting to be someone that you didn't even know you wanted to be, or I mean it's just so there's just so much good there. Really, there really is. Learning how to be a better team player, all kinds of things.
Is there take off your modesty hat for a moment and tell the world what's the thing that you're most proud of? Like, is there some? It doesn't even necessarily have to be a game or something you've or a book or something you designed on, but is there something you're really proud of that you think you're like, man, I just did. That's so fantastic. I'm.
This isn't what you're asking, but
Oh,
it's
that's
the
fine.
truth. So I'm going to answer it slightly differently. I am very proud to have made a career out of doing something that I deeply love. And hopefully, like my proudest moments aren't like I made this game or I wrote this book. My proudest moments, honestly, are those moments when someone comes up to you at a convention or anywhere really and is like, I saw myself in this game. I saw myself in this book that you made. I didn't know that I was bisexual until I saw this character. I played this character. I didn't know, and I feel like those are the moments. So I guess I am proud that I am trying my best to make the world better through for others through the things I make. Um, it's kind of a big answer, but
I
it's
I
sort of true.
I no, I think that's I think you've answered the question perfectly. I actually I think that's a wonderful thing. Honestly, and I think it's a great thing maybe to end on. I appreciate the fact that you've shared your time with me today. Thank you so much. I always say this at the end of most programs because it's always true. I don't have people on here unless like I'm genuinely interested in it and I like their products and their stuff. Like I reached behind me and I grab stuff off the shelf and like it's all like stuff that I have with me. If you haven't checked out Monte Cook Games' stuff, if you haven't checked out Shanna's work, you are missing out. As a role player, if you're a storyteller, you're missing out as well. I really think you should do so. Um, Shauna, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the big program. Um, I appreciate your time very much.
You asked great questions, which I'm super appreciative of. Some of them are hard. I had to really
I
think
know.
about some of them,
Oh
which is
well,
great.
yeah. I try my best. I run them
Oh,
all
that's
past
awesome.
my mom before I ask them, and mom
Awesome.
always tells me. So at any rate, if you've enjoyed tonight's big program, please do like and subscribe, and maybe if you could help me out a little bit by maybe sharing this stuff, like you do the tweets or you do the shares or the I think there's a bell in there that you set when you subscribe or something like that. I don't even know what I'm doing here. That's how much help I need. So please do think about that. Um, I very much appreciate everybody stopping by. I'm going to take a little bit of a break for a few weeks because I'm sort of spinning up for Gen Con, and then we're going to like sort of explode back in a couple weeks. But I will be back, and so will Role Player with a Thousand Faces, and our actual plays, and the rest of the MML crew. Thank you everybody for watching tonight. Once again, thank you, Shauna, and to all of you, happy gaming and stay safe.
Thank you.